Today's speaker is Steve Pike, who is CEO of the Mass Clean Energy Center. Clean energy is something that's on the top of everyone's mind right now, and it's so important to all of us. So we're really looking forward to hearing what Steve has to say about what's been accomplished, what the Clean Energy Center has accomplished, what they're doing to encourage small businesses in Massachusetts, and how it might be a beacon for other states to follow. Steve is an avid hockey fan. He coaches, he plays, and has forever. And please join me in welcoming Steve Pike.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to all of you for being here this morning and joining me. I just want to do a sort of a quick poll. Do we have any manufacturers in the room? A manufacturer. Okay, technology companies, either products or services. Okay. Service providers, banks, lawyers, accountants, and the like. Okay. All right. So hopefully, the technology companies and manufacturers, there might be a couple of things that I hope you take away from this. Obviously, for the rest of you, it's something that actually, in the case of banks, I'll touch on at least one program that you might be interested in hearing more about. But perhaps more importantly, you can help me spread the gospel to your clients and the like. If there's just one or two things that you think maybe somebody out there could be interested in, then I will, I think, have achieved my goal for the day. Because quite frankly, SBANE is not an organization that MassCEC has had really much of any engagement with, and that's one reason that I'm here today, is to try to rectify that. So as far as the service providers know, and the technology and manufacturing representatives, I'm kind of curious, how much do your clients talk about energy and energy costs? Would you say it's number one concern, top three, top 5, top 10? Do they not even think about it? Top 3, manufacturing, top 3, banks. Some shaking heads and the like. Okay. So that's not unusual. Certainly in the discussions I've had with, particularly with manufacturing companies throughout the state, by and large, it's been one of their top 2 concerns. And it varies between energy costs and concerns about their workforce, and primarily being able to continue to fill the pipeline that they're going to need in the coming years as their workforce transitions to retirement and the like. So again, hopefully I'll touch on a couple of those topics as well. And there may be some things that that we're working on that could be of interest either to you directly or to your clients. So MassCEC, again, has have you heard of it? Anybody? At least heard of it? Okay. Has anybody actually worked with us? All right. Terrific. Great. All right. So we're a quasi-public agency, which means that we are much more like a government agency than a private sector or even nonprofit organization. But at the same time, we're very different from a public agency. We aren't quite as constrained by a lot of the rules and laws that public agencies typically have to abide by. So it does make us, relatively speaking, far more nimble, able to react far more quickly to market conditions, and really positions us as an enabler for not just enacting or supporting state policy, but also for helping to develop it. So we are not a policy shop. That's done by the Department of Energy Resources and the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. We are not regulators. That's done by DEP and the Department of Public Utilities. What we are at our core is an economic development agency. So we're very concerned with creating programs helping to create markets that have a broad-based economic impact. So we sort of measure our success in a number of different ways. There are a couple of statistics just to be aware of. The clean energy industry in Massachusetts now involves over 105,000 jobs. That is 74% growth since 2010, which is pretty remarkable. It's a nearly $12 billion industry in the state, and Massachusetts has been number one 6 years in a row in energy efficiency. The Bloomberg Innovation Index ranks Massachusetts as number one as well, and we are number one as a state in per capita investment in early stage clean energy companies. So all in all, some measures of success there. But frankly, the industry as a whole that we deal with is frankly small businesses. It's remarkable to me that we haven't had more engagement with your organization, given that 85% of our companies, the clean energy companies in Massachusetts, have fewer than 50 employees. Over 60% have fewer than 10. So this seems like it's a natural group for us to engage with to a far greater degree than we have to date. So some of the things that we try to tackle, and it really is a real broad brush. We have our hands in a fair number of pots. So we run programs that help residents, businesses, universities, municipalities actually install clean energy technologies. So those could be the solar panels that you see on roofs more and more frequently throughout the Commonwealth. That could be a wind turbine, of which you don't see all that many in Massachusetts. We're hopeful that you'll see them south of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket in the coming years in the water. We do hydroelectric, so real small hydro facilities. We do anaerobic digestion, which is taking food waste as well as by and large farm waste, combining them, creating gas, burning the gas to create power, and either distributing that power to the grid or to the on-site user. We also are involved in clean heating and cooling technologies. So these are things like air source heat pumps, which are essentially, they look at like small air conditioning units. We're involved in ground source heat pumps, biomass as well. So we run, by and large, rebate and loan programs for folks to actually install those kinds of technologies. We also invest directly in clean energy companies, so real early stage companies. We act in many ways like a venture capital firm. We do equity and debt investments. These are typically very early stage companies. They are pre-commercial. Either that or very early in their commercialization process, but that's another role that we play. We also work on technology development. So in the innovation sphere, I mentioned the commercialization. We have a commercialization curve, and many of the gaps that companies identify are real early in that commercialization curve. And so we try to, we work with early stage companies, as I've mentioned. We work with academics and universities. We work with standalone entrepreneurs and others to move their technologies along those commercialization stages. And I'll talk a little more specifically about some of those programs. And then lastly, we focus very heavily on workforce development. So really creating the next generation of workers for the clean energy industry. That really the primary program there that we run, or the one that most folks have heard of anyway, is an internship program. So putting primarily college or community college students at clean energy companies. We actually pay the companies to hire the interns. To date, since 2010, roughly 2,400 internships across over 360 companies. So, and then there are two other undertakings that you should be aware of just in terms of the scope. And those are, I refer to them as business units. And so we actually own and operate two different assets in Massachusetts. One is the Wind Technology Testing Center, which if you're ever heading out of Boston, either north on 93 or north on Route 1 over the Tobin, if you look into the auto port where all the cars are, there's a large block building at the either northern or western end, depending on sort of your perspective. You usually can see the word wind on it. That was a facility that we built with both federal and state funding. And we operate it and have operated it for the last 6 years or so. The last 4, it's actually been, from an operations standpoint, revenue positive, which is nothing short of a small miracle, quite frankly, for a government-run organization or entity or facility of any sort, but certainly of its sort. It tests early-stage prototype wind blades, so blades that are right now predominantly 50 to 60 meters in length. The WTTC runs it through a battery of tests. Their customers are private sector product developers, and their revenue depends upon ensuring that those customers are happy. So Rahul and his group over there have been doing a terrific job. They also partner quite closely with many of the local universities, particularly Lowell. Is starting to develop a wind R&D program that's quite strong, and it's in no small part because of their ability to use the WTTC to run experiments and the like. The other asset is down in New Bedford, the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. So we were actually tasked with building a port facility, not something that we would typically undertake, but it was originally conceived to support the Cape Wind Offshore Wind project, which ironically on the day that Cape Wind lost its power contracts with the utilities was the day that we received the certificate of substantial completion on the facility. So we were counting on Cape Wind as a tenant for at least a couple of years and have ended up having to scramble to try to fill the space down there. It's roughly 26 acres or so of very, very highly engineered, essentially looks like a large parking lot, to be honest. But it is a parking lot that can sustain the extremely heavy loads that the offshore wind industry requires to deploy their projects and will in the future require, given that those components are becoming larger and larger and heavier. I mean, they talk about thousands of tons, these components. So those are a couple of other assets that we manage. That one, sorry to say, has not been revenue positive as yet, but we are very hopeful and optimistic. We do have tentative agreements with the developers who are proposing to build projects south of Martha's Vineyard, each of them to use that facility. So we're very optimistic that in a couple of years, we'll have a different story to tell on that. So I'm going to just run through a couple of the programs that I'm hopeful are relevant to at least some of you, and that by the time I get through the menu here, each of you will have something to take away, something that will have lodged up top. And again, whether it's for your company directly or for your clients, I look forward to engaging further on whatever the issue might be. So one that I want to touch on is a program, we refer to it as solar plus storage for manufacturers. So as I mentioned, we hear often from manufacturers that energy is a huge challenge for them. It's a big cost center. Now, some manufacturers in Massachusetts have gone about installing solar and what have you. Most haven't. And so what we want to try to do is provide some sort of incentive or make it at least a little bit easier for those manufacturers to think about solar. And if they have solar, perhaps think about adding storage to it. The value there being, of course, that manufacturing is typically hurt from a cost perspective because of the significant peaks that they have in their energy use. And those peaks tend to set the prices for them. So if they can as they say, peak shave. So if they can reduce that peak, they can reduce their costs. And storage certainly can be helpful in that regard by storing the power from the solar when the manufacturing facility is not in need, and putting it back into the facility during those peaks. It can shave off the spikes there. So given that there hasn't been a whole lot of uptake from what we could tell with solar, never mind storage in Massachusetts, what we decided to do was essentially hire a consultant to go out to manufacturers and provide a feasibility study. So a technical feasibility study as well as economic financial feasibility study. Make sure that it actually makes sense for them to do that financially. We went out with the goal of hitting 50 different manufacturers in the state, and which I thought was going to be, frankly, a slam dunk. Much to my dismay, we topped out at about 30. Now, I don't know why that is. I don't know if folks are just too busy, business is too good, or not good enough that they don't want to be or can't find the time to be bothered with that. Is it in part that we didn't do a good enough job getting out there and making the program known? My sense is it's probably a combination of those two, and perhaps there are other factors involved. But that's an example of a program where I think this organization, not only would its members or its members' clients benefit, but also certainly we would benefit from engaging with SBANE on a program like that and helping to get the word out. I just asked, it was either yesterday or the day before, the guy that was running the program, I said, did we reach out to the Small Business Association, given that, that is not a small portion of the population that we're trying to attract with these programs? And he said, nope, never even crossed my mind. Never crossed our communications group's mind. Never crossed my mind. And so that's one reason that I'm here today, is to hopefully start to develop a little better dialogue and engagement and interaction. So that particular program is, for now anyway, closed out. We're actually moving forward with the feasibility studies for the 30 or so manufacturers that have raised their hand. But I would anticipate and hope that we might, that we might run a second round of that. And so that is something that certainly we'll make sure that all of you know about. Another one is the Mass Solar Loan. And so some of the bankers may be aware of this one, and if they aren't, then hopefully this is one that you'll take away from this morning. So the Mass Solar Loan, I mentioned that one of the things we do is help folks install commercially ready clean energy technologies. Solar panels is the one that most people are aware of just because they've become relatively pervasive throughout the state. There are roughly 75,000 residential systems at this point, between 70 and 75,000. So we started out with that program. We provided a rebate, so just a direct rebate to primarily to the homeowner. As the popularity of that program grew, it of course started taking a larger and larger portion of our annual budget along with it. And so it just wasn't scalable and sustainable. Not only that, but from a policy perspective, a market development perspective, you don't want to create a situation where any market is completely dependent upon government subsidies for the long haul. Frankly, if you look at the solar industry in Massachusetts, and any of those of you who have tracked it, there has been a fair bit of discussion over the last particularly 3 to 4 years as to how we might go about that transition from a heavily subsidized and incentivized program in industry to one that is hopefully eventually not subsidized at all. And that has been a tremendous hair pull, both from a policy standpoint in the executive branch as well as in the legislature. Our program is not the only part of this discussion. The legislature has a say, as always, and there are other policy mechanisms that the Department of Energy Resources has in place as well. But we realized that at least our portion of the program was not sustainable. And so we shifted from a rebate program to a loan program where we actually provide funding to local banks, community banks, credit unions as well, that then run the programs on their own. And the hope there, of course, is to make the relatively limited dollars that we have go further, but also to hopefully get banks comfortable with underwriting these assets. From our perspective, it's not really any different from any other home improvement loan, or even, frankly, a car loan, except that it actually produces revenue over time, at least as currently structured. The incentives do. And so in many ways, it's very unlike any other home improvement in that you have a revenue stream that is pretty reliable over time. So we did that. We used 3 different mechanisms. And again, even that program is starting to transition. We have an interest rate buy down. So we actually provide cash directly to the banks to buy down some of the interest rate that they're providing to the homeowners. We have a loan loss reserve that we provide that is, of course, based on the creditworthiness of the buyer. And then we have income-based loan support as well, where we will provide an extra kicker to the banks if the homeowners are low or moderate income. And that's really the direction that the program as a whole is shifting in the coming months, is that each of those pieces will be available only to low and moderate income participants in the program. To date, quite frankly, 65% of the funding that we've put out on the street has gone to low and moderate income. So, and in the last few months, we've actually seen a slowdown in the interest rate buy down and an uptick in the income-based or credit-based portions of the program, which is curious to us. We don't really know why that's happening, unless to some extent it's just a natural shift in the market and the program. So that's another one. Hopefully the bankers will take that one back with them and think about that one a little bit. For those of you that own commercial, industrial facilities or what have you, we also have a variety of programs that support the installation of clean heating and cooling technology. So I mentioned air pumps, ground source heat pumps, and the likes. We provide incentives for residential installation of those, but we also do commercial projects as well. And so you can receive, depending upon the program and depending upon the technology, upwards of $250,000 to install those technologies. Those programs have been up and running for only a year or so. And so, again, we'd like to see more aggressive uptake. If that's something that your company is contemplating either directly or some of your clients are struggling with it, again, that's an area that I would really encourage you to reach out to us on. Offshore wind is an interesting area. I've sort of obliquely referred to it a couple of times so far this morning, but the legislature last summer, so 2016, as well, passed a bill that provided not just essentially large-scale hydro, as well as with some wind, and arguably you might be able to get some solar in there, although economically that'll probably be a challenge. Most folks refer to it as the hydro legislation. Was also paired with a process by which the utilities would solicit projects for offshore wind as well. From our perspective, a heck of a lot of work went into getting to that day. And at the same time, our work has just begun. MassCEC has been involved in helping to lay the groundwork for the development of those projects for the last, since our creation, which was roughly 2009. So for the last 8 years or so, we've run a number of different programs to essentially kind of provide a baseline of data for the development of these offshore wind areas, which are anywhere from roughly 14 miles or so to 20 miles south of Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. we've been involved in the development of the RFP. So what that legislation required was that the utilities had to go out and solicit projects, solicit bids. The development of that RFP was quite a process. It's now out on the street. Those bids are due essentially by the end of the year. The decision-making process and contracting process will take place over the course of next year. Now that ball has been rolling, what we've really started focusing on is helping to develop the supply chain. So the only offshore wind project that's been built in North America is right off of Rhode Island, right off of Block Island. It's a 5-turbine project, 30 megawatts, which pales in comparison to the 1,400 megawatt projects that are being built in Europe. But it's those developers, as well as the Rhode Island developer, that are well positioned to help develop these projects just off the Massachusetts coast. New York is also looking at projects just off of their coast, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia a little bit, the Carolinas. So what we're hoping will happen is an entirely new industry will be created in North America, and primarily it'll start on the East Coast. What we want to do for Massachusetts is make sure that because we're Massachusetts, we have to be the hub of everything, right? So we want to be the hub of the offshore wind industry. I liken it to Denmark. So Denmark first installed offshore wind, again, a similarly sized project, actually more turbines, but they were far less powerful because it was 27 years ago. It was in 1991. What that enabled Denmark to do is really to become the leader in the supply chain development in Europe. And as a result, a couple of countries have overtaken them in terms of actually deploying the technology off their coast. So the UK is number 1, Germany is number 2, Denmark I think is still number 3, although France is a pretty close number 4. But Denmark remains, maybe not for long, but still remains number 1 in terms of supply chain because they started early, and so they had that first mover advantage. We're trying to do the same thing in Massachusetts. One of the ways that we're doing this is really just to convene people, bring folks together, so that they understand what the industry is about. That the industry can talk to Massachusetts companies and describe what they think they're going to need in the coming months and years. So we actually pulled together what we referred to as a offshore wind supply chain forum in May over in Newton. And we had roughly 150 Massachusetts companies meeting with supply chain players, companies like GE, companies like Siemens, like Vestas, and others, as well as the developers, which are in some cases extremely large companies. And so that's something that went over very well. A main focus of that was literally matchmaking sessions. So the entire afternoon was comprised of not just programming, but also the opportunity for those Massachusetts companies to sit down with the supply chain participants, the big supply chain companies, and engage in a conversation, a direct one-on-one conversation. There were nearly 300 of those conversations that happened. So we heard back uniformly across the board that, terrific event, something that both the supply chain folks as well as the Massachusetts companies want us to do again. So we're at least initially thinking that we may do another one of those forums in the spring of next year, early summer, something of that sort. So that's another way that I think this organization and MassCEC can engage to a much greater extent. So I'll spend just a couple of minutes on some of our innovation programs. So I mentioned technology development and some of the programs we run there. We try to, and again, I'm not sure exactly how applicable this will be to member companies. It may be very applicable to, the lawyers in the room who have early stage companies in particular, or accountants or bankers that have those sorts of relationships. But we run a few different programs. So one is we refer to as Catalyst, and that is real early stage. So academics and entrepreneurs, companies who have an idea, have something that they think is going to work, but need help building, proof of concept or a prototype product to truly prove that it actually does work. So we provide relatively modest, but we found pretty effective funding, upwards of $65,000, to help them develop that particular product. We also support, I heard, SBIR, Susan mentioned that earlier. We provide matching funds for federal grant applicants. So they put in their application. Oftentimes, the application can really be burnished and supported well by a letter of support or a commitment to match at least a portion of the federal funding. And so we do that for clean energy companies as well, for a variety of different programs. SBIR is actually one of them. We also work a little further down the commercialization curve. So we often hear from companies that it's, in fact, I was just reading the article last night when I got home, because I never see the paper in the morning. I'm always at least 24 hours behind in the news. But MIT just started a new incubator and investment fund called the Engine. So the idea is that they are going to try to tackle some of these problems that, frankly, professional investors have shied away from because they are very difficult. They're very costly, and they take a long time to solve. And so MIT has seen an opportunity there, and they've created their own venture fund and their own incubator. So a place that these early stage companies can be housed. What they have found is that their investors are very keen on providing these companies not just the funding, but the sort of structural support that's necessary to see their product all the way to commercialization. And one of the specific areas that they mention in this article as being a challenge is companies oftentimes they can at least get to a prototype stage, prove out the prototype, then they need to prove it out in an actual commercial demonstration. And they can never find anyone to fund that because in order to fund, people want that already proven, which makes perfect sense if you're a financial, perhaps even a strategic investor. So that's one of the that's sort of one of the gaps or one of the trouble areas that MIT is trying to solve for. And we do the same thing for clean energy companies. It's a program we call Innovate Mass, and so it provides up to $250,000 for companies who have a product but need to demonstrate it at a commercial site and in a commercial environment. Hopefully, what they do is they demonstrate that successfully, and that then propels them to an investment stage and makes them far more attractive to investors. I already mentioned the investments program that we have, those direct equity and debt investments. Another one that I think is is an interesting one. It takes a lot of work on our part, but is using, refer to it as deploy mass. So we try to utilize state or municipal assets to deploy technologies. And so this program has been a challenge because by and large, state and municipal agencies are not really driven to do much that's new and different. And so, there's just a significant cultural gap to bridge between those agencies and a startup company who by definition is doing something new and different. And so we initially built this program and we said, all right, well, we're going to try to give the state agencies comfort that the products work. So we have a third party come in and essentially validate the product and its technology readiness levels and the like. And we'll provide some funding because that's another big hurdle for the state or municipal agencies. And we figured, if you build that, they will come. And they didn't come. It didn't happen. Literally not a single transaction happened. So we took a little bit of a step back and we said, well, what's really needed to make this work? And we realized that essentially what both parties needed was a business development agency. They basically needed a broker. And so we stepped in to fill that gap. And so the third piece that we've added, we still do the technology assessment, we still provide funding, but we're much more active in the deal-making process. So we will proactively reach out to state agencies, municipalities that we know are trying to solve or should be trying to solve particular problems and try to match them with companies. And oftentimes it's the companies who have identified an opportunity, but they have no idea how to navigate the morass that is, state procurement. And so it's through that handholding we've actually had a number of successes. In fact, the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs just last week was out at XL Hybrids, which is a company located in Brighton. What they do is essentially upfit fleet vehicles with a hybridization technology that saves upwards of 30% of the fuel costs for those vehicles. So that was something that was very attractive to some of the other agencies within that secretariat. So you can think in particular Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Parks Department. They have a fair number of vehicles. And so not just cost savings for them, but all from fuel and what have you, but also given that they're in the environmental agencies, reducing greenhouse gases, which is clearly a priority of this administration and that secretariat. So that's one example where we've provided some funding and provided the comfort level and engagement on both sides to make those deals work. So just a couple of last points, and then I'd actually would really enjoy hearing from you some of the questions that you might have. One is we also indirectly support the industry. And so by that, I mean supporting accelerators, incubators, and the like. You can think Mass Challenge or Greentown Labs, which is the largest clean energy company incubator in the known world anyway. You never really know what's going on in China. And we specifically have supported Greentown Labs. They have actually started a Western Massachusetts manufacturing initiative where they have somebody who sits in Western Massachusetts and tries to help connect their companies here in Boston with Massachusetts manufacturers in the western part of the state. It was something that we all identified as a bit of a frustration that those companies were going elsewhere for their manufacturing needs, not because they had to, but because when they Googled manufacturer, somebody else came up. And so trying to make those direct connections. That's a pretty early stage program, probably been up and running for 6 months or so, but something that, we're really enthusiastic about and looking forward to some real positive results. The other portion that I mentioned real briefly was workforce development. So we run the internship program. We're also trying to reach down a bit further into the educational system. And again, this is a place where any number of your companies may well be able to help us out and engage. Is we've started developing what we call a learn and earn program at the high school level. So it's both curriculum as well as hands-on work. They might develop a solar project on at a school facility in a town, or they might, in the case of, it was Malden High School, I believe, they built a small, what we refer to as a tiny house. It's right there in front of the school, and they are going to build solar panels on it. They're going to put a storage pack in as well, and they'll be able to monitor it over time. And they have ideas about adding on to the house over time and really creating a good set of curriculum around that. We've also started trying to reach down into the elementary schools. So just this past year, we did what we call Clean Energy Days. So it's just a single day of clean energy curriculum. Typically, the kids will either build a solar-powered car or this sounds a little odd, but a solar-powered frog or cricket. So they hop when they have enough energy. or they'll do a wind turbine or what have you. Actually, the last one, which they find the most interesting, is a solar oven, because they all end up doing s'mores at the end of the project, and that pretty much makes all the torture worth it. But that, again, is part of that program, is bringing companies, typically clean energy companies, into the schools to talk about what they're doing and what they see as the opportunities down the road. Not that any third grader is thinking, what am I going to be doing in 15 or 25 years from a job perspective? But you hope to plant those seeds, and if nothing else, maybe plant the seeds for interest in in the sciences or in engineering or technology development or something of that sort, so that if they don't end up in clean energy, they may well end up in some other technology or science, or engineering focused enterprise. So that gives you some idea of what we're up to. I hope that each of you was able to grab onto at least one thing, and that you'll take that back with you, mull it over, and reach out to whether it's me or just the organization as a whole. So I appreciate your time and look forward to continuing the discussion. Do you want to do Q&A, Susan? Or
yeah,
okay.
Questions for Steve?
There's some concern in the banking industry about the stability of the market and the subsidies for clean and renewable energy projects. I was up before the legislature yesterday, TUE, and looking at the tremendous support among the telecommunications, utilities, and energy committees for clean and renewable energy. And I can't imagine that we aren't going to continue that support. Perhaps you could comment on that and give the bankers here some assurance that we are not going to go ahead and back away from it like the federal government is.
So, yeah, I think it's pretty clear from the governor that Massachusetts will not be backing away from its clean energy and climate commitments. It's been an interesting 2.5 years or so, in that the administration, when they came in, I don't think was quite as engaged in clean energy. Certainly as the last administration, it was really a sort of an apple of the last governor's eye. And so there's been a fair bit of learning that's gone on, but to the administration, and particularly the governor's credit, has really listened very closely, has asked a lot of really hard questions, and at the end of the day is frankly downright enthusiastic about certainly certain aspects of clean energy. The solar debate that's been going on is sort of one aspect of it. I was at an event last Tuesday. The governor spoke, and he went very much off script for about 5 minutes, talking about storage and the value of storage and his interpretation of the value of storage. So that makes it, to me, very clear that he's very engaged in these issues and is very committed to these issues. So, so I don't anticipate any backing away in Massachusetts. I think that, if the federal government were to back away, particularly on the early stage research and development and commercialization funding that they do, which, by the way, Massachusetts, in the prior 5 years saw $720 million in federal investment. So it would be a big hit for our clean energy economy. We can't replace that, I don't know that it's particularly practical, given some of the other pressures on the state budget, to think that we can entirely replace that. But what we certainly will be committed to doing is being pretty creative about how we try to fill some of those gaps to the extent they arise. MassCEC isn't going anywhere. There is a lot of support, as you note, in the legislature. We're continuing to look at sort of new and different and creative ways of of helping to finance the industry, whether it's technology development, innovation, or whether it's deploying actual commercially ready technologies. There are certain things that, perhaps Massachusetts could wade into. There's a lot of discussion every year about green banks, for instance. New York has $1 billion plus, and that is obviously very helpful for their efforts. My primary question with that sort of suggestion is, well, what is it that you want to accomplish with a green bank? Our solar loan program is very much a green bank-like product. And so, let's talk a little more specifically about what you want to try to accomplish. And maybe one, we're already doing it. But two, maybe there are other ways that we can do it. I think that conversation will continue. I don't see Massachusetts backing off. I think if anything, we'll do our part to fill the breach should one open up. We're still hopeful it won't. There's a lot of congressional support for the clean energy programs at the federal level, even if there isn't necessarily a lot of support at the upper levels of the executive branch. So we're still hopeful. Yeah, Mark.
Steve, so I think that was a great presentation. Our program is innovation, so we work with wind, solar, and hydro. So I have a specific example would be in the hydro space. With dams on a precast segments, what an SBAR grant put together a working model in 3.5 hours on a lot, and it proved to work. And now
French development.
Exactly. I don't know if you talked to them, but it almost seems like his next steps, among other commercialization efforts, is to be sort of a hybrid of what you've done already, which is brokering between his company and municipals, but also having sort of that financial model of teaching the municipals of going through the evaluation of what the cost models might be,
right,
versus installation costs and operating. But according to the Department of Energy, 50% of the dams in the U.S. are reaching the stage of the end of their life, which is 7 years. So it is coming to pass, and it would be part of the supply chain across the U.S. $2.5 billion represents 5% of the U.S. market to overcome it. So I almost see that there is a role here with MassCEC to do sort of that connection and also the business model for municipals.
Agreed, and with those types of products, which tend to be more capital intensive, where we tend to try to play is, again, earlier in the development process. So we'll provide funding for site suitability studies, feasibility studies, some of the early development work, and perhaps a bit of kind of construction, or in the case of hydro, there aren't too many new dams being built or brand new turbines being put in, but to rehab what is there. So absolutely. I know that our team was very directly involved with French development. I remember the demonstration project. What I don't know is what has happened since. And so, that may well be a conversation that we should have. But we do try to provide, opportunity for those discussions to happen and to actually fund, studies of that sort for municipalities or private owners for that matter. It can certainly be through me. In this particular case, it could be Amy Barad or Rachel Ackerman. They both work on the hydro projects. Amy's been doing it for years. She's really, really fantastic. And Rachel has joined her recently from one of our other programs. But they're terrific. So I would encourage them to reach out and stay in contact. Yep. Anyone else? Okay. Terrific. Well, thank you. Really appreciate, again, your time.